The floorboards bit cold against Clara's cheek, splinters catching at her torn dress as she lay where she'd fallen. Each breath came shallow and sharp, like swallowing broken glass. The pain in her side had settled into something deeper now, a grinding ache that spoke of things bent wrong inside her chest. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered to the empty air, her voice barely stirring the dust motes that danced in the thin shaft of afternoon light cutting through the cabin's single window. Outside, she could hear Jeremiah's boots on the porch boards, that familiar heavy tread that had once meant safety when she was small, before the drink took hold of him proper. Before their PA died and left them with nothing but this patch of hard ground and Jeremiah's growing anger at a world that had dealt them short. The boots stopped. Clara held what breath she could, counting the seconds. Sometimes he forgot. Sometimes the rage passed through him like a fever breaking, and he'd come back in with his old face on, confused and sorry, bringing her water and sitting quiet while she mended whatever had gotten torn this time. But not today. Today the silence stretched too long, and she knew he was standing out there, working himself up to something worse. The door scraped open. Clara didn't lift her head. She'd learned years ago that looking at him when he was like this only made it harder. Better to be still, to be small, to let whatever storm was in him blow over her and be done. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." She hadn't heard him speak. The words hit her like cold water, and she realized she'd been drifting, the pain pulling her down into that gray place where nothing quite felt real. "I said, look at me, Clara." The leather of his work boots came into view first, scarred and stained dark. Then his hands, knuckles still raw from whatever he'd been hitting before he came for her. She made herself meet his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had been their mother's once, before the years wore them down to something flat and strange. "You think you're too good for the work I give you," he said. His voice was quiet, which was worse than the shouting. When Jeremiah got quiet, it meant he'd moved past anger into something colder. "Think you're better than this place? Better than me?" Clara wanted to tell him that wasn't true, had never been true. She'd scrubbed the floors and mended his clothes and cooked what little they had without complaint. She'd never asked for anything beyond what they already had, which was near to nothing. But the words wouldn't come. They never did when he was like this. "Pa always said you had too much of Ma in you," Jeremiah continued, circling her now like she was something he was fixing to brand. "Said it would make you soft. Guess he was right about that." The mention of their parents made something twist in Clara's chest, separate from the broken ribs. Their PA had been a hard man, but fair. Their Ma had been gentle right up until the consumption took her. Neither of them would have recognized the man Jeremiah had become. "Get up!" Clara tried. She pressed her palms against the rough boards and pushed, but the pain in her side flared white-hot, and she collapsed back down with a gasp that might have been a sob. "I said get up!" His boot caught her in the shoulder, not hard enough to break anything new, but enough to send her sliding across the floor until her back hit the wall. She stayed there, hunched against the logs, and felt something precious and fragile inside her chest give way. Not her ribs this time, though they throbbed with each heartbeat. Something deeper. Something that had been holding on despite everything. Some small part of her that had still believed things might change, might get better if she just endured long enough. That part of her died quiet on the cabin floor, and in its place came something else. Not peace exactly, but a kind of emptiness that felt almost like relief. "You can't even do that right," Jeremiah said, and she heard the disgust in his voice like he was talking about a broken-down horse that needed putting out of its misery. Can't do nothing right. He was right, she realized. She couldn't do anything right, couldn't make him happy, couldn't make the pain stop, couldn't even die proper when that might have been a mercy for them both. The light from the window had shifted while she lay there, painting a different rectangle on the opposite wall. The afternoon was wearing on. Soon it would be dark, and Jeremiah would drink himself to sleep. And there would be a few hours of quiet before morning came, and they'd start this dance all over again. but lying there against the wall. Something in Clara's broken chest began to whisper. Not words exactly, more like a feeling, a notion that maybe there was somewhere else beyond these walls, beyond this endless cycle of pain and forgiveness and pain again. Maybe there were people in the world who didn't use their hands for hurting. Maybe there were places where a person could breathe without counting the cost. The thought was so foreign, so dangerous, that she pushed it away almost before it formed. But it had been there, real as the splinter in her palm or the ache in her bones. A tiny seed of something that might have been hope, planted in ground that had seemed too poisoned to grow anything good. She closed her eyes and let the whisper fade, but she didn't forget it. Couldn't forget it, even when Jeremiah finally turned away and left her there on the floor. Even when the sun went down and the cabin fell into the familiar darkness of another evening survived. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered again, but this time the words felt different. Not just a statement of fact, but something else. A recognition that a person could be broken and still be breathing, could be bent near to snapping and still have something left inside that no amount of hurt could touch. Outside, a nightbird called lonesome across the empty miles, and Clara listened to its song until sleep took her where she lay, still pressed against the wall, still whispering promises to herself that she wasn't quite ready to believe. Dawn came gray and bitter through the cabin's single window, finding Clara still curled against the wall where sleep had claimed her. Her body had stiffened in the night, ribs screaming protest with each shallow breath. But something else had hardened too, a resolve that felt fragile as spun glass but sharp enough to cut. Jeremiah's snores rattled from the back room, thick with the whiskey that had finally pulled him under near midnight. She'd counted the hours by the sound of his restless turning, waiting for the deep, steady rhythm that meant he wouldn't wake for hours yet. He always slept heavy after the bad nights, like the violence had worn him out same as it had her. Clara eased herself away from the wall, biting back the sounds that wanted to escape her throat. Each movement was a small agony, but she'd learned to breathe through pain, to make herself smaller than the hurt. Her bare feet found the floorboards she knew wouldn't creak, the path she'd memorized during countless nights of trying not to wake him when she fetched water or tended the fire. The door stood between her and whatever lay beyond these walls. She'd looked at it 1,000 times, but never like this. Never as something she might actually walk through and not come back. Her hand closed around the iron latch, cold as winter bone against her palm. For a moment she stood frozen, listening to Jeremiah's breathing from the other room. If he woke now, if he found her here with her hand on the door like some wild thing fixing to bolt, but he didn't wake. The snoring continued, and Clara lifted the latch with the slow care of a person defusing dynamite. The morning air hit her face like a slap, sharp with the promise of heat to come but still cool from the night. She'd forgotten how big the sky was, how far it stretched in every direction without walls to hem it in. For a moment, the vastness of it made her dizzy, and she had to grip the door frame to keep from falling. The porch boards were rough under her feet, weathered smooth in some places and splintered in others. She'd swept them clean yesterday morning, back when yesterday morning felt like someone else's life. Now, each step carried her further from the girl who'd done that sweeping, who'd still believed in the possibility of peace if she just tried hard enough. At the edge of the porch, she paused, looking back at the cabin that had been the whole of her world for as long as she could remember. It looked smaller from out here, meaner somehow, like a wound in the landscape that had never healed proper. Then she turned away and didn't look back again. The dirt road that led away from their homestead stretched out pale and dusty in the growing light. Clara had walked it before, but only as far as the creek to fetch water, or to the woodline to gather kindling, never beyond the bend where it disappeared into the stands of pine and scrub oak that marked the edge of the known world. Each step sent fire up her side, but she kept walking. The sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rust, and still she walked. When the pain got too sharp, she'd stop and lean against a fence post or a boulder, counting breaths until she could manage another few yards. The road wound through country that might have been beautiful if she'd had the luxury to notice. Rolling hills covered in sparse grass, stands of trees that whispered secrets in languages she'd never learned. But Clara's world had narrowed to the stretch of dirt in front of her feet and the rhythm of putting one foot ahead of the other. By midday, the sun was a branding iron pressed against her shoulders. Her dress, already torn from yesterday's troubles, clung to her with sweat and offered no protection from the heat. The soles of her feet, soft from years of wearing shoes that had long since fallen apart, began to crack and bleed on the rough ground. She stumbled more often now, catching herself on rocks or going to her knees when the pain overwhelmed her balance. Each fall was harder to recover from. Each time it took longer to convince her body to stand again. But she kept moving, driven by something stronger than sense or self-preservation. The fear helped. Every distant sound, a bird taking flight, a branch snapping in the wind, sent ice through her veins with the thought that it might be Jeremiah, awake now and tracking her like a hunter following wounded game. She knew he'd come eventually, knew he wouldn't let her go without a fight, if only because losing her meant losing the last thing in the world he had power over. Late afternoon found her collapsed beside the road, back pressed against a sun-warmed boulder that felt almost kind against her aching spine. Her water had run out hours ago, and her throat felt lined with dust. The landscape around her had grown wilder, more desolate. Fewer fences, fewer signs that people had tried to make a life in this hard country. Maybe this was how it ended, she thought with something approaching peace. Maybe she'd pushed far enough to die free, even if she couldn't live that way. There were worse fates than becoming bones beside a lonely road. At least the sky here was bigger, cleaner somehow. At least Jeremiah's hands couldn't reach her if she died here. That's when she heard the hoofbeats. At first she thought it was her heart, drumming so hard with sudden terror that it seemed to echo off the hills around her. But the sound grew clearer, more distinct. A horse at full gallop, coming up the road behind her. Clara tried to stand, tried to run, but her body had nothing left to give. She managed to drag herself a few feet off the road into the sparse shadow of a stunted pine before her strength gave out entirely. If she stayed very still, very small, maybe whoever it was would pass by without seeing her. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. "Easy there, Ranger, easy now." A man's voice, low and steady, talking to his horse. Clara squeezed her eyes shut and tried to make herself invisible, tried to become just another shadow among the rocks and scrub. But she could hear him dismounting, hear his boots on the packed earth as he approached her hiding place. "Miss." The word was gentle, careful, not the tone of a man looking to cause harm. But Clara had learned not to trust gentle words from men. They could turn sharp as knives without warning. "Miss, are you hurt?" Closer now. She could hear his breathing, smell the leather and horse sweat and something else. Soap, maybe, or just the scent of someone who hadn't given up on cleanliness despite the harsh country. "I'm not going to hurt you." That's what they all said, one way or another. But there was something in this man's voice that made her open her eyes despite herself, made her look up into a face she'd never seen before. He was crouched a few feet away, far enough not to crowd her, but close enough that she could see the concern in his dark eyes. A big man, broad-shouldered and weathered by sun and wind, but holding himself careful-like, the way a person might approach a spooked animal. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, and his voice held no judgment, only a kind of weary kindness that Clara hadn't heard in so long she'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. She tried to speak, to tell him she was fine, to send him on his way before Jeremiah came looking, but all that emerged was a broken whisper. "My ribs are already broken." The stranger's face changed when she spoke those words, something shifting behind his dark eyes like clouds passing over deep water. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her the way most men would have. Instead, he settled back on his heels, giving her space to breathe. "I can see that," he said quiet-like, and there was no pity in his voice, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. "How long you been walking?" Clara tried to think. Time had gotten strange out here under the endless sky, hours bleeding together like watercolors in rain. Since dawn, she managed, though it felt like she'd been walking forever, like she'd been born on this dusty road with bleeding feet and broken bones. The man nodded, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her sunburned shoulders, the way she held herself careful against the pain. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 35 or 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. His clothes were well made but weathered, the leather of his vest soft with age and use. "My name's Thomas," he said. "Thomas Garrett, and you don't have to tell me yours if you'd rather not." The kindness in that simple statement nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had given her a choice about anything? Even something as small as sharing her name. "Clara?" she whispered, and the word felt strange on her tongue, like she was introducing herself to herself for the first time. "Clara." He repeated it careful-like, testing the shape of it. That's a good name, a strong name. She wanted to laugh at that, or maybe cry. There was nothing strong about her. She was broken glass held together with spit and prayers, a collection of hurts wrapped in skin too thin to contain them all. Thomas must have seen something of that thought cross her face, because his voice got gentler still. "You're hurt bad, more than just the ribs. I'm thinking." It wasn't a question, so she didn't try to answer. Just watched his face for the signs she'd learned to recognize, the moment when patience turned to impatience, when gentleness hardened into something else. But Thomas just waited, still as stone, like he had all the time in the world. "Someone did this to you," he said finally. And again it wasn't a question. Someone you trusted to keep you safe. The accuracy of it hit her like a physical blow, and she found herself nodding before she could stop herself. Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping under the skin. But when he spoke, his voice stayed level. "They coming after you." This time she did try to speak, to warn him about Jeremiah and what he was capable of when his blood was up. But the words tangled in her throat, came out as nothing but a broken sound that might have been yes, or might have been a sob. Thomas nodded like he understood anyway. "Then we best get you somewhere safe." He stood slow and easy, hands visible and empty. "I got a place not far from here. Cabin in the woods where a person can rest without worry. You willing to trust me that far?" Trust. The word felt foreign as a language she'd never learned. How could she trust a stranger when the people who were supposed to love her had taught her that safety was just another word for the calm before the storm? But lying there in the dust with the sun beating down merciless and her body screaming protest with every breath, Clara realized she was out of choices. She could stay here and die slow beside the road, or she could take the chance that this man with the kind eyes and gentle voice might be different from the others. "I can't," she started, then stopped. The truth was too big, too shameful. She couldn't walk much further, couldn't run if Jeremiah caught up, couldn't even stand without help. "I know," Thomas said, and somehow he did know. Saw all of it written in the careful way she held herself, the exhaustion that went deeper than tired. "That's all right. I got a good horse and steady hands. Won't hurt you worse than you already are." His horse stood patient a few yards away, a big sorrel gelding with intelligent eyes and a gentle way of breathing. Not the kind of animal a violent man would ride. Horses knew things about people, could sense the meanness in a person's heart. This one looked calm as Sunday morning. Thomas approached her slow, telegraphing every movement like she was a wild thing that might bolt. "Going to help you up now?" he said, and waited for her nod before reaching out. His hands were careful. Sure, calloused from work but gentle as a mother with a sick child. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, like she was something precious that might break if handled rough. The movement sent fire through her ribs, but she bit back the sound that wanted to escape. "Easy now," he murmured, and she realized he was talking to her the same way he'd talked to his horse, like she was something worth gentling, worth patience. Almost there. The saddle was sun-warmed leather, softer than anything she'd felt in years. Thomas settled her careful against the horn. then swung up behind her with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. His arms came around her loose and careful, taking the reins without crowding her. "Lean back if you need to," he said. "Won't think less of you for it." Clara wanted to stay upright, to prove she wasn't completely helpless, but the pain was a living thing inside her chest, growing stronger with each beat of her heart. When she finally let herself rest against Thomas's solid warmth, she felt some of the tension she'd been carrying for years start to ease. The horse moved smooth as flowing water, each step measured and sure. Thomas guided him off the main road onto a smaller track that wound between stands of pine and aspen. The trees offered blessed shade, and Clara closed her eyes and let the gentle rhythm of the horse's gait carry her away from the worst of the pain. "Almost there," Thomas said after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. "Just around the bend." Clara opened her eyes to see a small log cabin nestled in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines that whispered secrets to the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney, pale against the darkening sky. A garden plot showed neat rows of vegetables, and there was a well with a bucket waiting. It looked like the kind of place she'd dreamed about as a child, before she learned that safety was just another fairy tale. "It's not much," Thomas said, and she could hear something like uncertainty in his voice. "But it's solid, warm, safe." Safe. There was that word again. Impossible as flying, but looking at the little cabin with its welcoming windows and careful garden, Clara found herself wanting to believe it might be true. Found herself wanting to believe that places like this existed in the world, where a person could rest without counting the cost. Thomas dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. The ground felt strange under her feet after so long on horseback. Solid, but somehow unreal. She stood swaying while Thomas led his horse to a small corral behind the cabin, talking to the animal in that same gentle voice. "Come on then," he said, returning to her side. "Let's get you inside before you fall down." The cabin door stood open, warm yellow light spilling out into the gathering dusk. Clara looked at it and felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Fragile as spun glass and just as likely to shatter, but hope all the same. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she took a step toward something instead of away from it, toward warmth and light and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world held more kindness than cruelty after all. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered again, but this time the words carried a different weight. Not just a statement of damage, but something else. A recognition that broken things could sometimes be mended, given time and gentle hands and a safe place to heal. Clara woke to the sound of wood crackling in a fireplace, a sound so foreign after years of cold mornings that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. The air smelled of pine smoke and something cooking, beans, maybe, or stew. Real food, not the thin gruel and hardtack that had been her usual fare. She lay still, keeping her breathing even while she took stock. Soft wool blanket covering her instead of the rough burlap she was used to. A real bed beneath her. Not the hard floor or thin pallet she'd known. The pain in her ribs was still there, but duller somehow, wrapped in warmth that seemed to seep into her bones. The cabin was larger than it had seemed from outside. One big room with a stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows on the log walls. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books. More books than Clara had seen in her whole life. A table sat near the window, sturdy oak worn smooth by years of use. Everything spoke of a man who'd taken time to make a place feel like home, not just shelter. "You're awake." Thomas's voice came from the fireplace, where he was stirring something in a black pot hung over the flames. He didn't turn around, didn't crowd her with attention, just acknowledged her consciousness the way he might note the sunrise. Natural. Expected. Nothing to make a fuss over. "How long?" Clara's voice came out rough as bark, and she realized her throat was dry as summer dust. 2 days, Thomas said, ladling whatever he was cooking into a wooden bowl. "You were in a bad way. Fever broke yesterday evening." 2 days. Clara tried to remember, but there was nothing after the moment she'd stepped through his door. Just fragments, cool water against her lips. Gentle hands changing damp cloths on her forehead. A voice reading aloud from one of those books when the dreams got too dark. Thomas approached the bed slow and careful, like she was a wild bird that might take flight. The bowl in his hands sent up steam that made her stomach clench with sudden, fierce hunger. "Rabbit stew," he said, settling into a chair someone had pulled up beside the bed. "Nothing fancy, but it'll put some strength back in you." He held out the bowl and spoon, then paused when Clara didn't immediately reach for them. "You want to sit up some? Might be easier." The simple question undid something inside her chest. When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted? What might be easier for her? She nodded, and Thomas helped her ease up against the pillows he'd stacked behind her. His touch was professional, careful, like he'd done this before. The first spoonful of stew nearly made her weep. Rich with herbs she couldn't name, thick with vegetables that had been grown with care, food that had been made to nourish, not just fill an empty belly. She ate slow, trying to make it last, trying to memorize the taste of kindness. "Easy now," Thomas said when she started eating faster. "Been too long since you had a proper meal. Don't want to make yourself sick." Clara forced herself to slow down, though everything in her wanted to devour the entire bowl before someone could take it away. Thomas seemed to understand this too, because he left the pot where she could see it, left the ladle nearby. "There's more when you're ready for it," he said. "No need to rush." They sat in comfortable silence while she ate, Thomas tending the fire and checking something that was baking in a Dutch oven buried in the coals. Clara watched him move around the cabin, noting the economy of his movements, the way he seemed to know exactly where everything belonged. This was a man who'd made peace with solitude, who'd learned to care for himself without forgetting how to care for others. "Why?" The word slipped out before she could stop it, hanging in the air between them like smoke. Thomas looked up from the bread he was checking. "Why what? Why help me? You don't know me. Don't know what I might have done." Clara set down the spoon, appetite fading under the weight of old shame. "Don't know what kind of trouble I might bring." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "Had a sister once," he said, settling back into his chair. "Sarah, married young to a man who seemed decent enough, came calling all proper-like, brought flowers, minded his manners around our folks." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach, knowing where this story was heading. Wasn't until after the wedding that his true nature showed. Thomas continued. "Sarah would visit with bruises she tried to hide, stories that didn't quite add up. We all saw it, but she kept saying everything was fine, that we didn't understand." He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the darkening woods. "She stopped visiting after a while, stopped coming to church, stopped answering letters. When I finally rode out to check on her." He paused, something dark passing over his features. "Found her in the barn. Neck broke from a fall. Her husband said horse spooked, threw her." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "I'm sorry. Horse was gentle as a lamb," Thomas said, voice flat with old grief. "Never spooked at anything in its life, but nobody wanted to call a grieving widower a liar. Nobody wanted to ask the hard questions." He turned back to face her, and Clara saw something in his eyes that she recognized, the weight of failing someone you loved, of not acting when action might have made a difference. "So when I see someone hurt the way you're hurt," he said, "I don't ask questions. I don't wonder what they might have done to deserve it. I just help, because maybe this time I can make a difference." The honesty of it, the raw pain in his voice, made Clara's chest tight with something she couldn't name. She'd expected pity or curiosity or the kind of false sympathy that came with strings attached. But this was something else entirely, a grief shared, a burden lifted by being acknowledged. "I didn't do anything," she said quietly. "I mean, I wasn't perfect, made mistakes, spoke out of turn sometimes, but I tried to be good, tried to keep the peace." "I know," Thomas said, and the simple certainty in his voice made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "It's not about what you did or didn't do. Some people just carry hurt inside them. and they spread it around because they don't know how else to be. Clara nodded, unable to speak around the knot in her throat. She'd spent so many years wondering what she'd done wrong, what she could have done different. To hear someone say it wasn't her fault, that she hadn't deserved what happened, it was like water to someone dying of thirst. "Your brother," she managed finally. "The one who hurt you." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shuddered behind his eyes. "How'd you know it was my brother?" "The way you knew." Clara said, "Some pain. You can only learn it one way." They looked at each other across the warm cabin. Two people who'd learned the same hard lesson from different teachers. The fire crackled between them, and outside the wind whispered through the pines like a lullaby. "Jeremiah," Clara said, testing the name on her tongue. "My brother's name is Jeremiah. He wasn't always... It started after our parents died. The drink, the anger. He said he was trying to keep me safe, keep me in line. Said the world was too hard for someone like me." "And you believed him?" Clara considered the question, tasting the stew that had gone lukewarm while they talked. "For a long time, yes. He was all the family I had left. And he wasn't wrong about the world being hard. Just wrong about what kind of hard I could handle." Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them without need for more words. They'd both learned that family could be the place where love lived, or the place where it went to die. They'd both learned that sometimes saving yourself meant walking away from the people who were supposed to love you most. "He'll come looking," Clara said, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since she'd woken up safe and warm. "He won't let me go without a fight." "Let him come," Thomas said, and there was something hard in his voice, something that spoke of a man who'd stood his ground before. "This is my land, my home, and you're under my protection now." Protection. Another word that felt foreign, dangerous to believe in. But looking at Thomas across the firelit cabin, seeing the steady resolve in his dark eyes, Clara found herself wanting to believe it might be true, for the first time in years. She closed her eyes without counting the cost, without listening for footsteps that might mean pain. The blanket was soft around her shoulders, the fire warm against her face, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called lonely and free through the mountain night. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered into the gathering darkness. But for once the words felt like a beginning instead of an ending. 3 weeks passed like water through cupped hands, each day blending into the next in a rhythm Clara had never known before. She woke with the sun streaming through clean windows instead of to the sound of angry voices. She ate meals that filled her belly instead of scraps thrown her way like she was some barn cat. She spoke when she wanted to speak and stayed quiet when words felt too heavy, and Thomas never demanded explanations for either. The broken ribs were mending, though they still caught her breath when she moved wrong. Her hands had lost their constant tremor, and the hollows under her eyes were filling out from regular meals and uninterrupted sleep. But the deepest healing was harder to measure, happening in moments so small she almost missed them. The first time she laughed at something Thomas said, the morning she woke without immediately listening for danger, the evening she realized she'd stopped flinching every time he moved too quick. It was on a night when autumn had painted the world in shades of gold and rust that Clara found herself sitting by the fire, watching Thomas read by lamplight. He had a way of holding books like they were precious things, turning pages careful-like, sometimes reading passages aloud when he thought she might enjoy them. Tonight it was Whitman, something about the open road and the freedom to choose your own path. "Were you a teacher?" she asked, sudden-like, the question escaping before she could think better of it. Thomas looked up from his book, firelight dancing across his weathered features. "What makes you ask that?" "The way you read, the books. You got more learning than most folks out here in the middle of nowhere." He was quiet for a moment, considering. Studied to be one, back east. Philadelphia, had notions about civilizing the frontier through education. A rueful smile crossed his face. Turns out the frontier had other ideas about what civilization looked like. Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story. Thomas had a way of offering pieces of himself like gifts, never demanding she reciprocate but leaving space for her to share if she wanted. Came out here with my wife, he continued, closing the book but keeping his finger between the pages to mark his place. Margaret. She was the real teacher, had a gift for it. We were going to start a school, maybe build it into something that could serve the whole territory. The past tense hung heavy in the air between them. Clara had noticed there were no women's things in the cabin, no trace of a feminine presence beyond the careful way Thomas kept house. She'd wondered but never asked, understanding that some stories came in their own time. "What happened?" she asked, gentle-like. "Fever took her the second winter we were here. Bad one that year, swept through half the settlements. She nursed folks through it. Wouldn't let me stop her even when she started showing signs herself." His voice went quiet, distant with memory. "Always said if you had skills to help, you had an obligation to use them." Clara felt the familiar ache of loss, different from her own but no less real. "I'm sorry." Was 5 years ago now. Long enough that the sharp edges have worn smooth, but not so long that I've forgotten why I loved her. Thomas opened the book again, smoothed the pages with gentle fingers. "These were hers, most of them. She made me promise to keep reading, keep learning. Said knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from you once you had it." The wisdom of it settled into Clara's chest like a warm stone. In all her years with Jeremiah, she'd never been allowed books, never been encouraged to think beyond the daily tasks of survival. The idea that learning could be armor, could be something that belonged to her alone, was revolutionary. "I can't read," she said, the admission coming out smaller than she intended. "I mean, I know my letters some, can make out words if they're simple enough. But real reading, the kind you do," she gestured at the book in his hands. "Never had the chance to learn proper." Thomas looked at her with something that might have been surprise, but not the cruel kind that made her feel stupid, more like he was recalibrating something in his understanding of her. "Would you like to learn?" he asked. "I mean really learn, not just getting by, but reading for the joy of it." The offer hit her like a physical thing, so unexpected and generous that for a moment she couldn't breathe around it. To read books, to understand all those rows of words that had always seemed like a secret language spoken by people better than her, it was a dream she'd never dared voice even to herself. "I'd like that," she whispered, and the words felt like a prayer. They started that very night. Thomas pulling his chair close to hers so they could share the lamplight, opening one of the simpler books to a story about a girl who lived in a garden. He read first, pointing to words as he spoke them, then had Clara try. She stumbled over syllables that felt foreign on her tongue, but Thomas was patient as stone, never making her feel foolish for taking time to sound things out. It became their evening ritual. After supper, after the day's work was done, they'd sit by the fire and Clara would practice reading while Thomas mended harness or whittled or just listened. Some nights she'd manage whole paragraphs without help. Other nights the letters seemed to swim on the page and she'd get frustrated. But Thomas would just pour more coffee and suggest they try a different story. It was during one of these reading lessons, nearly a month after she'd arrived, that Clara found herself telling him about Jeremiah. Not the worst of it, not at first, but the smaller hurts that had built up over years like sediment in a riverbed. "He wasn't always like that," she said, finger tracing a line in the book she'd been reading from. "When we were little, after Ma died, he used to tell me stories at night when I couldn't sleep. Made them up himself, about brave girls who went on adventures and saved kingdoms." Thomas nodded, not interrupting, just letting her talk at her own pace. "Pa worked us hard, but fair. Expected us to pull our weight, but never more than we could handle. When he passed, Jeremiah tried to step into that role, but he was only 19 himself. Scared. I think, though he never would have admitted it." Clara turned the page, though she wasn't really seeing the words anymore. "First time he hit me was about 6 months after we buried Pa. I'd burnt supper, nothing major, but he was already wound tight from trying to manage the property and the creditors and everything else. Just backhanded me across the mouth and then stood there looking as shocked as I felt." She touched her lip unconsciously, remembering the taste of blood, and the way Jeremiah had immediately started apologizing, promising it would never happen again, that he'd just been tired and worried and not thinking straight. But it did happen again, Thomas said quietly. Not right away. Months would go by sometimes where things were almost normal. He'd be the brother I remembered. Would read to me or teach me to shoot or fix things around the place. Then something would set him off. Money troubles. A bad harvest. Sometimes just the wind blowing wrong, and he'd take it out on me. Clara closed the book, no longer able to pretend she was following the story. I kept thinking if I could just be better, more helpful, less trouble, maybe he'd stop. Took me years to realize it wasn't about anything I did or didn't do. It was about him having someone smaller than him to push around when the world got too big for him to handle. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. My brother Caleb was older than me by 4 years, always bigger, always stronger. After our folks died, he got mean drunk most nights and mean sober the rest of the time. He rolled up his left sleeve, showing Clara a scar that ran from wrist to elbow, white and jagged against his weathered skin. Got this when I was 16, tried to stop him from breaking everything in the house after he lost our last horse in a card game. Clara stared at the scar, understanding flooding through her. You left too. Soon as I turned 18 and could legally claim my inheritance, took what was mine and never looked back. Thomas rolled his sleeve down again, but his eyes stayed on Clara's face. Caleb came after me once, about 2 years later, found me in Denver. Demanded I come home and help him save the family farm. What did you do? Told him the farm could rot for all I cared, and if he ever came near me again, I'd kill him. The flatness in Thomas's voice sent a chill down Clara's spine. Meant it too, still would. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them and the wind sighing through the pines outside. Clara felt something loosening in her chest. Some knot of shame and guilt that had been pulled tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. You think I'm a coward, she said finally, for staying as long as I did? No. Thomas's response was immediate, certain. I think you survived the only way you knew how. I think you held on longer than most people could have, hoping for something better. And when you finally ran, you did it with broken ribs and no shoes and nowhere to go. Which makes you about the bravest person I've ever met. The words hit her like a benediction, like absolution for sins she'd never committed but had carried anyway. Clara felt tears start to flow, not the bitter tears of pain she'd cried so often, but something cleaner, something that felt like release. Thomas didn't try to comfort her or tell her not to cry. He just sat there steady as a mountain while she wept for the girl she'd been, and the years she'd lost, and the brother who'd chosen cruelty over love. When the tears finally stopped, he handed her his handkerchief and went to make fresh coffee, giving her space to compose herself. My ribs are already broken, Clara said when he returned, testing the words that had become her refrain. But maybe that just means they can heal stronger than before. Thomas smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him. And something warm unfurled in Clara's chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since she'd fled into the wilderness, she allowed herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond mere survival. A future where broken things could indeed grow back stronger, where trust could be rebuilt one careful stone at a time, where love might be something that healed instead of something that hurt. Outside, the autumn wind whispered promises through the trees, and Clara listened with ears that were finally learning to hear hope instead of danger in the night sounds around her. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp November morning when Thomas returned from checking his snares with a face gone hard as winter stone. Clara looked up from the book she'd been reading. She could manage most of Whitman now without help, and felt her stomach drop at his expression. What is it? She asked, though part of her already knew. The peace had lasted too long. Felt too complete. In her experience, happiness was always borrowed time. Thomas set down the rabbits he'd caught and moved to the window, scanning the tree line with eyes that had gone sharp and wary. Someone's been asking questions in town, man matching Jeremiah's description, looking for a woman who might have passed through, offered money for information. Clara's hands went cold around the book. She'd known this day would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but somehow she'd let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd given up the search, that he'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble of finding. How much money? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Thomas turned to look at her with something like surprise. Does it matter? It might. Clara set the book aside with hands that trembled only slightly. Jeremiah's got a silver tongue when he wants to use it, and most folks out here don't have two coins to rub together. If he's offering enough, someone will talk. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. Ben Morrison at the general store seemed interested. Asked a lot of questions about what this woman might have done, whether there was a reward involved. Clara felt the walls of the cabin pressing in around her, the warmth and safety she'd grown to cherish suddenly feeling fragile as spun glass. Ben Morrison was a practical man who'd sell his own mother for the right price. If Jeremiah had convinced him that Clara was a runaway thief or worse. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "Nothing, but I could see him thinking, putting pieces together. He knows I don't usually have visitors, knows I've been buying supplies for 2 instead of 1. Thomas moved away from the window, began checking his rifle with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. Figure we got maybe a day, 2 at most, before someone decides that money's worth more than minding their own business. Clara watched him work, noting the way his movements had changed. Gone was the gentle man who'd taught her to read by firelight, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, someone who'd learned to survive in a world where trust was a luxury most couldn't afford. "You should leave," she said quietly. "Take what you need and go. I won't be the reason you lose your home." Thomas looked up from the rifle, and for a moment his expression went soft around the edges. "This is my land, Clara, my home, and I don't run from bullies, especially ones who hurt women. You don't understand what he's like when he's cornered, what he's capable of." Clara stood, began pacing the small space like a caged animal. "He won't come alone, won't fight fair. He'll bring men with him, men who'll do whatever he pays them to do. Then we'd better be ready for them." The certainty in Thomas's voice made Clara stop pacing. She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she'd missed before. The way he held the rifle, familiar as breathing. The scar on his left hand that could only have come from a knife fight. The quiet confidence of a man who'd faced down trouble before and lived to tell about it. "You were a soldier," she said, and it wasn't a question. 2 years in the cavalry, chasing Comanche across half of Texas. Thomas finished cleaning the rifle, set it aside, and began checking his pistol. Learned some things about fighting and dying and which men you could count on when the shooting started. Clara felt a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief that Thomas wasn't the innocent she'd sometimes imagined him to be, that he understood the kind of violence Jeremiah could bring. Terror that it might not be enough, that her brother's cruelty might destroy this good man the way it had destroyed everything else she'd ever cared about. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Thomas showed Clara how to load and fire his spare pistol, how to aim and breathe and squeeze the trigger steady. Her hands shook the first few times, but muscle memory seemed to kick in. Jeremiah had taught her to shoot, back when he was still trying to be the brother she remembered. "Don't think about it being a person," Thomas said as Clara practiced with an empty gun, pointing at knots in the cabin wall. "Think about it being the thing that stands between you and staying alive." As the sun began to set, painting the clearing in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas positioned himself by the front window while Clara took the back. The waiting was the hardest part. Sitting in the growing darkness with every sense straining for sounds that didn't belong. "Maybe I was wrong," Clara said around midnight, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe he won't come tonight." "He'll come," Thomas replied, and his certainty sent ice down her spine. "Men like your brother, they don't give up easy. He's had months to work himself up to this, months to convince himself that you belong to him." Clara was about to respond when she heard it. The distant sound of horses moving through the trees, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Thomas heard it too, his body going still as a hunting cat. "How many?" Clara whispered. Thomas tilted his head, listening. 3, maybe 4, coming from the north. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, the old fear rising like bile in her throat. But underneath it was something new, something harder. She wasn't the same broken girl who'd fled into the wilderness months ago. She'd learned to read, learned to think, learned that she was worth more than the scraps of kindness Jeremiah had occasionally thrown her way. The horses stopped just outside the clearing, and Clara could hear voices conferring in low tones, then footsteps, moving careful through the underbrush, trying to surround the cabin. "Clara!" Jeremiah's voice cut through the night like a blade, loud and commanding. "I know you're in there. Come out now and we can settle this peaceful-like." Thomas looked at her, eyebrows raised in silent question. Clara shook her head. There would be no peaceful settling with Jeremiah, not when his pride was wounded and his authority had been challenged. "You got no right to keep her," Jeremiah continued, his voice moving as he circled the cabin. "She's family. She belongs with me. She belongs to herself," Thomas called back, his voice carrying clear across the clearing. "And she's chosen to stay here." The silence that followed was thick with menace. Clara could picture Jeremiah's face, the way it would twist with rage at being defied by a stranger. He'd never been able to stand it when people didn't fear him the way she had. "You don't know what you're dealing with, mister." Jeremiah's voice had gone cold, dangerous. "That girl's sick in the head, tells lies, causes trouble everywhere she goes. I'm trying to save you from making a mistake." The words hit Clara like physical blows, even though she knew they were lies. This was Jeremiah's way, making everyone else the problem, painting himself as the reasonable one forced to deal with difficult people. "Only mistake I see is you not turning around and riding away." Thomas replied, his voice steady as stone. "This is private property, and you're trespassing. Leave now, and we'll call it even." Jeremiah's laughter was ugly, full of malice. "You think you're some kind of hero, taking in strays? Let me tell you something about that girl. She's nothing but trouble wrapped up in a pretty package. Soon as she gets what she wants from you, she'll run off and leave you with nothing but heartache." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, fighting against the poison in those words. They were lies, had always been lies. But Jeremiah had a way of making them sound true, making her doubt everything she knew about herself. "Clara." Thomas's voice was quiet, meant for her alone. "You know who you are. Don't let him take that away from you." She opened her eyes, met his gaze across the darkened cabin, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Thomas was right. She did know who she was now, not the broken thing Jeremiah had tried to make her, but someone worth saving, worth protecting, worth loving. "I see movement by the woodshed," Thomas murmured, raising his rifle. "2 men, trying to get around back." Clara gripped her pistol tighter, the metal warming under her palm. Outside. She could hear the creak of leather and the whisper of cloth against wood as Jeremiah's men positioned themselves. "Last chance. Clara!" Jeremiah shouted. "Come out now or I'll come in and get you." Clara looked at Thomas, saw the question in his eyes. This was her choice to make, her stand to take. She could surrender, could walk out there and let Jeremiah drag her back to the life she'd escaped, could spare Thomas the violence that was coming, or she could fight. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Jeremiah," she called out, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I'm done running, done hiding, done letting you decide what my life looks like." The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Then Jeremiah's voice rose in a roar of pure fury. "You ungrateful little witch! I gave you everything, kept you fed and housed and safe, and this is how you repay me? You kept me prisoner!" Clara shot back, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. "You beat me down every chance you got, made me think I was nothing, made me grateful for scraps. I protected you. Jeremiah's voice cracked with rage. "The world would have eaten you alive without me. The only thing I needed protection from was you." The words rang out across the clearing like a bell tolling. Clear and true and final. Clara felt something break loose inside her chest. Some last chain that had bound her to the frightened girl she used to be. Thomas squeezed her shoulder, pride and fierce protectiveness shining in his dark eyes. "Get ready," he whispered. "Here they come." The attack came from 3 sides at once, boots thundering across the clearing as Jeremiah's men rushed the cabin. Clara saw muzzle flashes in the darkness, heard the sharp crack of gunfire and the whistle of bullets through wood. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was done being afraid. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered to herself as she took aim at a shadow moving past the window. "But my spirit isn't." And for the first time in her life, Clara fought back. The gunfight lasted only minutes, but to Clara, it felt like hours. She fired through the back window at shapes moving in the darkness, her hands steady despite the thunder of her heart. Thomas's rifle cracked from the front of the cabin, methodical and deadly accurate. She heard someone cry out in pain, then cursing, then the sound of boots retreating through the underbrush. When the shooting stopped, the silence was so complete it felt unnatural. Even the night birds had gone quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Stay down," Thomas whispered, reloading his rifle without taking his eyes off the window. "This isn't over." Clara crouched beneath the windowsill, pistol clutched in trembling hands. Her ears rang from the gunfire, and the cabin smelled of smoke and cordite. Through the shattered glass, she could see muzzle flashes still blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness. "Jeremiah!" she called out, her voice carrying clear across the clearing. "I know you're out there. Why don't you show yourself instead of sending other men to do your fighting?" The taunt hung in the air like a challenge. Clara held her breath, waiting, knowing her brother well enough to predict his response. Jeremiah had always been proud, had never been able to stand being called a coward. "You think you're so smart now, don't you?" His voice came from somewhere near the tree line, rough with anger and something that might have been hurt. "Got yourself a man with a gun. Think that makes you safe?" "Safer than I ever was with you," Clara shot back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "At least Thomas never raised his hand to me. I never hurt you." Jeremiah's shout cracked across the night like a whip. "Everything I did was to keep you in line, keep you from making mistakes that would ruin your life." Clara felt the old familiar twist of guilt in her stomach, the automatic response she'd learned over years of being told she was the problem. But this time, something else rose to meet it. Anger, clean and bright as a blade. "You broke my ribs," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You broke them because I burned supper, because I spoke when you didn't want me to speak, because I existed in a way that inconvenienced you. You're remembering it wrong." "I remember everything." Clara stood slowly, moving to where Jeremiah could see her silhouette in the window. Thomas made a sound of protest, but she ignored him. This was something she had to do, had to finish. "I remember every blow, every cruel word, every time you made me feel like I was nothing." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken truth. When Jeremiah spoke again, his voice had gone quiet, dangerous. "Come out here, Clara. Come out and we'll settle this proper." "No more settling," Clara said. "No more pretending you were protecting me when you were just using me as something to hit when the world didn't bend to your will." She could hear him moving in the darkness, circling the cabin like a wolf looking for weakness. Thomas had positioned himself by the door, rifle ready, but his eyes kept flicking to Clara with something like worry. "You always were ungrateful," Jeremiah called out. "Always thought you deserved better than what you had. Ma spoiled you, filled your head with notions about how special you were." "Ma loved me," Clara said, and the words felt like armor around her heart. "She saw worth in me that you tried to beat out of me every chance you got. She saw what she wanted to see, just like this fool you've taken up with." Jeremiah's voice was getting closer, and Clara could hear the creak of leather as he moved. "You think he loves you? You think any man could love something as damaged as you?" The words hit like physical blows, but Clara found they didn't penetrate the way they used to. Months of Thomas's gentle care, his patient teaching, his quiet certainty that she was worth protecting. It had built something inside her that Jeremiah's poison couldn't dissolve. "Maybe he does," she said simply. "Maybe I'm worth loving after all." The sound Jeremiah made was part laugh, part snarl. "You're worth nothing." "You're broken, Clara, broken in ways that can't be fixed. And deep down, you know it." Clara looked across the cabin at Thomas, saw him watching her with fierce pride in his dark eyes. She thought of the books they'd read together, the meals they'd shared, the way he'd held her when nightmares woke her screaming, the way he'd never once made her feel small or stupid or worthless. "You broke my ribs," she said, her voice rising strong and clear. "You broke them and you broke my spirit and you tried to break my will. But you didn't break me. Jeremiah, you didn't break me." She stepped fully into the window frame, making herself a target, daring him to take the shot. "I'm still here. I'm still standing. And I'm done being afraid of you." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, charged with the kind of tension that comes before lightning strikes. "You little witch," Jeremiah whispered, and Clara could hear the venom in his voice even from across the clearing. "You ungrateful, worthless little witch. That's enough." Thomas's voice cut through the darkness like a blade, cold and final. He stepped into the doorway, rifle leveled, and Clara saw something in his posture that made her blood run cold. This was no longer the gentle man who'd taught her to read. This was the soldier, the killer, the man who'd learned violence in the cavalry and never forgotten how to use it. "You've said your piece," Thomas continued, his voice carrying across the clearing with deadly calm. "Now you can leave. Take your men and go, and we'll call it even." Jeremiah's laughter was ugly, broken. "You think you can just take what's mine? Think you can steal my sister and there won't be consequences?" "She's not yours to steal," Thomas said. "She never was. She's my blood, my responsibility. She's a grown woman who's chosen her own path." Thomas took a step forward, and Clara saw moonlight gleam on the barrel of his rifle. "And if you can't respect that choice, then we've got nothing more to talk about." Clara heard movement in the darkness, the soft scrape of boot leather on stone. Jeremiah was positioning himself for a shot, probably trying to get an angle on Thomas while he stood exposed in the doorway. "Thomas," she said quietly, urgently. "He's moving." But Thomas had already sensed it. He shifted his stance, rifle tracking toward a shadow that moved between the trees. "I see him." The tension in the air was so thick Clara could barely breathe, everything balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for someone to make the first move. "Last chance, Jeremiah." Thomas called out, "Walk away now, while you still can." "I ain't walking away from nothing." Jeremiah's voice cracked with rage. "She belongs to me." "No," Clara said, and her voice rang out clear as a bell in the mountain air. "I belong to myself. I always have, and I choose to stay here, with a man who treats me like I'm worth something." She saw the muzzle flash an instant before she heard the shot. Jeremiah had fired from the trees, aiming not at Thomas but at her, the ultimate act of spite, destroying what he couldn't control. But Thomas was faster. His rifle cracked like thunder, and Clara heard Jeremiah cry out in pain and surprise. The shadow in the trees stumbled, fell, lay still. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas was beside her, hands gentle but urgent as he checked her for wounds. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice shook with reaction. "I'm all right." From the darkness came the sound of horses, of the remaining men fleeing rather than face Thomas's rifle. Clara listened to the hoofbeats fade into the distance and felt something inside her chest finally, fully relax. "Is he—" She couldn't finish the question. Thomas moved to the window, peered out into the clearing. Wounded, badly, but alive. He looked back at Clara, his expression unreadable. "What do you want to do?" Clara considered the question, thought about the brother who'd tormented her for years. who just tried to kill her rather than let her go. She thought about mercy and justice and the difference between them. "Help him," she said finally. "Tend his wounds, give him water, then send him away." Thomas nodded like he'd expected that answer. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Clara set down the pistol, her hand steady now. "I won't let him turn me into something cruel. I won't let him take that from me, too." They found Jeremiah by the edge of the clearing, bleeding from a shoulder wound that had shattered his collarbone but missed anything vital. He was conscious, glaring up at them with eyes full of hate and pain. "Should have killed me," he spat as Thomas began binding the wound. "Should have finished it. Probably." Thomas agreed conversationally. "But Clara's got a kinder heart than either of us deserve." "Sssss." Clara knelt beside her brother, looked into the face that had haunted her nightmares for months. Up close, he looked smaller somehow, older, worn down by years of anger and alcohol and the kind of loneliness that came from driving away everyone who might have cared about him. "This is the last time, Jeremiah," she said quietly. "The last time I'll ever see you. The last time you'll have any power over my life. Do you understand?" He tried to spit at her, but the effort made him wince with pain. "This ain't over." "Yes," Clara said with absolute certainty. "It is." They got him on his horse with Thomas's help, though Jeremiah cursed them both through gritted teeth the whole time. Thomas had packed the wound tight and rigged a sling, but it would need proper doctoring if infection wasn't going to set in. "There's a dock in Cedar Falls," Thomas said, handing Jeremiah the reins. "About 20 miles north. You might make it if you don't stop to drink yourself stupid." Jeremiah looked down at Clara one last time, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been regret. But then his face hardened again, and she knew that whatever brother she'd once loved was gone for good. "You'll regret this," he said. "Both of you. Mark my words." "No," Clara said, stepping closer to Thomas, feeling his solid warmth at her back. "I won't." They watched him ride away into the darkness, swaying in the saddle but staying upright. Clara listened until the hoofbeats faded completely, until there was nothing left but the wind in the trees and the distant call of a night bird. "Think he'll come back?" Thomas asked. Clara considered it, thought about her brother's pride and his capacity for holding grudges. Then she thought about the look in his eyes as he'd ridden away. Not just anger, but defeat, the recognition that he'd lost something he'd never really owned. "No," she said. "He's done with me. Finally. Completely done." Thomas nodded, then turned to survey the damage to his cabin. Bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows, blood on the front steps. It would take work to set things right again. "I'm sorry," Clara said, following his gaze. "I'm sorry he brought this to your home." "Our home," Thomas corrected gently. "And it's just wood and glass. We can fix wood and glass." "Our home." The word settled into Clara's heart like seeds in fertile ground, and she felt something bloom there that was stronger than hope, more enduring than relief. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered, testing the familiar words one last time, but they felt different now, emptied of their power to hurt her. Just words, referring to old damage that time and care had healed. "But your heart isn't," Thomas said, understanding her without explanation. "Your heart is whole." Clara looked up at him in the moonlight, this man who'd saved her life in more ways than one, and knew he was right. Her heart was whole and strong, and finally, completely her own. The confrontation was over, the past was buried, and for the first time in her life, Clara faced the future without fear. Spring came early that year, painting the mountain meadows in shades of green Clara had never noticed before. She stood on the cabin's newly repaired porch, watching Thomas work in the garden they'd expanded together, and marveled at how different the world looked when you weren't afraid to lift your head and see it. 6 months had passed since Jeremiah rode away, bleeding into the darkness, and Clara had learned to count time in seasons instead of bruises. The bullet holes in the cabin walls had been patched over. the broken windows replaced with glass that let in more light than the old ones ever had. It was as if the violence had been absorbed and transformed into something stronger, something that could hold more joy than what came before. "The tomatoes are coming along good," Thomas said, straightening up and wiping soil from his hands. His movements were easy now, unguarded in a way they hadn't been during those tense weeks of waiting for trouble. "Should have enough for preserving come summer." Clara smiled at that, the casual assumption of a shared future, the planning for seasons they'd see together. It had taken her months to stop flinching when he spoke of tomorrow and next month and next year, as if such things were guaranteed instead of borrowed time that could be snatched away without warning. "I was thinking," she said, settling into the chair they'd built for the porch. "Maybe we could plant some flowers along the front path, make it welcoming for visitors." Thomas looked up with something like surprise. In all the months since the confrontation, they'd had precious few visitors, the occasional traveler seeking shelter, a neighbor borrowing tools, but Clara had never shown interest in encouraging more. "You expecting company?" he asked, but his tone was gentle, curious rather than concerned. "Maybe." Clara smoothed her skirt, a new one she'd sewn herself from fabric Thomas had brought from town. "I've been thinking about writing to the school board in Cedar Falls, about the teaching position that came open." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Thomas set down his hoe and came to sit beside her on the porch steps, close enough that she could smell the honest scent of earth and growing things that always clung to him after working in the garden. "You want to be a teacher?" he asked. "I want to help children learn to read the way you helped me." Clara said, "The dream taking shape in words for the first time. I want to show them that books can be doorways to places bigger than whatever cage they might be trapped in." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering. "It's good work," he said finally. "Important work. Margaret always said teaching was about more than letters and numbers. It was about showing people they had choices." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. They could talk about Margaret now without the shadow of grief that had once clouded Thomas's eyes when he spoke her name. Death was still a loss, but it no longer felt like a betrayal of memory to imagine new love growing in the same soil. "The position comes with a small house," Clara continued. "Right in town, big enough for a family, if—" She trailed off, suddenly shy. They'd grown close over the winter months, sitting by the fire, reading together, sharing quiet conversations that lasted until dawn, but they'd never spoken directly about what was growing between them, content to let it develop at its own pace, like wildflowers finding their season. "If what?" Thomas asked softly. Clara took a breath, gathered her courage. "If a certain former soldier wouldn't mind sharing it with a woman who talks too much and burns biscuits more often than not." Thomas was very still beside her, and for a heart-stopping moment Clara wondered if she'd misread everything, if the gentle affection between them was all one-sided comfort rather than the beginning of something deeper. Then he turned to face her, and the expression in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "Are you asking me to marry you, Clara Hartwell?" The use of her full name, the name she'd chosen for herself after fleeing Jeremiah's house, sent warmth flooding through her chest. "I suppose I am," she said, amazed by her own boldness. "Though I understand if you need time to think about it, I know I'm not what most men would consider." Thomas silenced her with a kiss, gentle and sure and tasting of new beginnings. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face like she was something precious. "I don't need time to think," he said. "I've been wanting to ask you the same thing for months. Just didn't know if you were ready to hear it." "I'm ready," Clara whispered, and knew it was true. She was ready for promises and plans and the terrifying joy of building a life with someone who saw her as whole rather than broken. "I'm ready for all of it." They sat together on the porch as the sun climbed higher, making plans in the golden morning light. They'd marry in the summer, when the wildflowers were blooming and the days were long and warm. Clara would apply for the teaching position, and Thomas would see about finding work in town, Carpentry, maybe, or helping at the livery stable. They'd keep the cabin for weekends and summers, a place to retreat when town life got too crowded. "What about children?" Thomas asked as they watched a hawk circle overhead. "The teaching position. Would you want children of our own as well?" Clara felt her heart flutter with something between hope and terror. She'd never dared imagine herself as a mother, had been too broken for too long to think about bringing new life into the world. But now, sitting safe in the sunshine with this good man beside her, the possibility felt like another door opening. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." As the day wore on, they found themselves working together with a new sense of purpose. Thomas repaired the fence around the vegetable garden while Clara organized his books, planning which ones they'd take to town and which would stay at the cabin. She paused over a volume of Whitman's poetry, remembering the first night Thomas had read aloud to her, when words had been mysterious symbols she couldn't decode. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud from Song of the Open Road. "Henceforth I ask not good fortune. I myself am good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing." Thomas looked up from his work, smiling at the confidence in her voice. "That's your poem," he said. "Your truth." Clara closed the book, holding it against her chest. "I used to think my ribs being broken was the most important thing about me," she said. "The thing that defined everything else. And now I think maybe it was just something that happened to me, something I survived." Clara set the book aside and moved to help Thomas with the fence. "It's not the most important thing about me anymore." They worked in comfortable silence until the afternoon began to fade, the sun painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. As they put away the tools and headed inside to start supper, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror by the door, a woman with clear eyes and steady hands, someone who stood tall instead of hunched over in anticipation of the next blow. "I hardly recognize myself sometimes," she said, touching her reflection with something like wonder. Thomas came up behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You look like yourself to me," he said. "Like the person you were always meant to be, underneath all the hurt." That evening, as they sat by the fire with Clara reading aloud from a new book they'd ordered from back east, she found herself thinking about time and healing and the way love could rebuild what cruelty had torn down. Her ribs had healed months ago, the bones knitting back together stronger than before. But the deeper healing, the mending of trust and hope and the simple belief that she deserved gentleness, that had taken longer, required more patience. "Thomas," she said, setting down the book, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from the harness he was mending, eyebrows raised in gentle inquiry. "When I was lying on that floor in Jeremiah's cabin, broken and hurting and thinking I might die there," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of memory, "I whispered to myself that my ribs were already broken. I meant it as surrender, as acceptance that I was too damaged to be worth saving." Thomas set aside his work, giving her his full attention. "But now I understand," Clara continued. "My ribs were already broken, but that didn't make me worthless. It just meant I was ready to heal, ready to be rebuilt into something stronger." She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "You didn't save me, Thomas. You gave me a safe place to save myself." Thomas raised their joined hands to his lips, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "We saved each other," he said. "That's what love does. It makes us brave enough to heal." Outside, night settled over the mountains like a blessing. The cabin was warm and bright, filled with the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Clara listened to the wind in the pines and thought of all the women who might be out there in the darkness, broken and afraid and convinced they were beyond help. She made a silent promise to them, and to the frightened girl she used to be, that her story would not end with survival alone, but with joy, that broken things could indeed grow back stronger, that love existed in the world, patient and kind and powerful enough to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered into the firelit quiet, and smiled at how the words had changed. "But my heart is mending." Thomas squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with love and infinite patience. "Let it mend," he said, echoing words from months ago that had once seemed impossible to believe. "Let it grow stronger." And in the warmth of their shared silence, Clara did exactly that.